$450. That was all it took for Frank Martinez to buy what he thought was just another piece of abandoned land. The auction listing called it a scrap yard, but when Frank first stepped onto the property, with his German Shepherd Rex, something felt wrong. Rex, a dog who had served alongside Frank in the military and never showed fear, suddenly planted his paws firmly in the dirt and refused to move forward. His ears flattened against his head, and a low whimper escaped his throat. Frank had never seen his loyal companion react this way to anything. Little did Frank know he had just purchased 30 years of buried secret that would soon put both their lives in mortal danger. Please support us by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Frank Martinez had been drifting since his wife Maria passed away 2 years ago. The small military pension wasn't enough to keep him busy, and the empty house in Riverside felt more like a tomb than a home. At 50-something, Frank still had the broad shoulders and steady hands of a soldier, but his eyes carried the weight of too many losses. Rex was all he had left now, a black and tan German Shepherd who had been his partner during his final years of service. The dog understood Frank in ways that people couldn't, sensing his moods and staying close during the worst nights when memories of Maria kept sleep at bay. When Frank saw the auction listing for the industrial property, he thought it might be exactly what he needed. A purpose. Something to rebuild with his own hands. The idea of running a small scrap metal business appealed to him. It would be honest work, the kind where you could see progress at the end of each day. Rex seemed to approve of most of Frank's decisions, following him everywhere with the patient loyalty that only military dogs possess. But today was different. Frank had expected Rex to be excited about exploring new territory, but instead the dog displayed behaviors that Frank hadn't seen since their deployment days when they encountered dangerous situations. Rex training kicked in immediately, his body language shifting to full alert mode, ears rotating independently to catch sounds that Frank couldn't hear, nose working overtime to process scents that carried information beyond human understanding. The transformation in Rex's demeanor was so complete that it brought back memories of their time together in dangerous places, where the dog's instincts had saved both their lives more than once. Frank trusted that instinct completely, even when he didn't understand what was triggering it. The scrap yard sat on 12 acres at the edge of Riverside, where the city gave way to empty lots and forgotten industrial buildings. Chain-link fencing topped with razor wire surrounded the property, though sections had collapsed over the years, creating gaps where weeds pushed through like nature reclaiming what humans had abandoned. Rusted car parts, twisted metal beams, and stacks of corroded pipes created a maze of shadows across the uneven ground. The air smelled of old oil, and something else Frank couldn't identify, something chemical and bitter that caught in the back of his throat. Margaret Thornfield, the auction representative, had been unusually rushed during the paperwork signing. A well-dressed woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled into a tight bun, she avoided eye contact and kept checking her expensive watch. When Frank asked about the property's history, she simply said it had been abandoned for decades, and the previous owners wanted it gone quickly. Her hands trembled slightly as she handed him the keys, and she was gone before Frank could ask any follow-up questions. Rex had watched her leave with intense focus, his head tilted in that way that meant he was processing something important. The dog's reaction to Thornfield had been subtle but unmistakable to Frank's trained eye. Rex had positioned himself between Frank and the woman throughout the entire transaction, a protective stance that indicated distrust. Even now, hours after she had left, Rex kept looking toward the road as if expecting her return, his body tense with anticipation of trouble. Frank made mental notes about Thornfield's behavior, filing away details that his military training had taught him to notice. The expensive jewelry, the nervous energy, the way she had seemed more concerned with getting the transaction finished than with answering basic questions about the property. Everything about her suggested someone who wanted to distance herself from this land as quickly as possible. Frank spent the first week just walking the property, making mental notes about what could be salvaged and what needed to be hauled away. Rex usually trotted beside him on these surveys, investigating interesting scents and marking his territory with the confidence of a dog who knew his place in the world. But here, Rex stayed close to Frank's side, never venturing more than a few feet away. The dog's behavior became more concerning when Frank found the old Geiger counter buried under a pile of rotting canvas near what looked like a former office trailer. The device was ancient, probably military surplus from the 1980s, but when Frank flipped the switch, it still worked. The clicking sound was soft at first, barely noticeable above the wind rustling through the metal debris. But as Frank carried it deeper into the property, following a path that Rex absolutely refused to take, the clicking grew faster. Frank had handled radioactive materials during his military service, but only in controlled environments with proper training and equipment. This felt different. Dangerous. When he tried to coax Rex forward to investigate a cluster of buried metal drums, the dog planted himself firmly and began to whine, a sound Frank had only heard once before, on a battlefield when Rex had detected an improvised explosive device hidden beneath seemingly innocent debris. The parallel wasn't lost on Frank. Rex was treating this place exactly like a minefield, using every instinct and training technique to warn his handler away from invisible dangers. Frank trusted Rex's judgment completely, but his curiosity about what lay buried here was becoming an obsession that threatened to override his better judgment. The more he explored with the Geiger counter, the more convinced he became that this wasn't random contamination. The patterns were too deliberate, the hot spots too organized to be anything other than intentional burial sites. Someone had used this land as a dumping ground for materials they desperately wanted to keep hidden from the world. Sarah Chen had been Riverside's only veterinarian for 8 years, ever since graduating from UC Davis, and she wanted to serve a community that really needed her skills. At 32, she was known for her patience with difficult animals and her willingness to make house calls for clients who couldn't afford her full fees. Her small practice doubled as an informal animal rescue, and her office walls were covered with thank you letters from grateful pet owners. Sarah also volunteered with the local environmental action group, testing water quality in streams and documenting pollution from the handful of factories that still operated on Riverside's outskirts. When Frank Martinez called her clinic about his German Shepherd's unusual behavior, Sarah was intrigued. She had seen anxiety in dogs before, but Frank's description of Rex's selective fear around certain areas of his new property raised red flags. Dogs, especially well-trained military dogs, didn't develop sudden phobias without good reason. Their senses were far more acute than humans, capable of detecting chemical traces that would be completely invisible to people. When Sarah arrived at the scrap yard the following afternoon, she brought her own equipment, a digital camera, water testing strips, and a newer Geiger counter she had borrowed from a colleague at the university. Rex's reaction to her presence was immediate and positive. The dog approached her with tail wagging, pressing his head against her hand in the way that dogs do when they recognize someone who genuinely cares about animals. Sarah had a gift with scared animals, moving slowly and speaking in soft tones that conveyed safety and understanding. Within minutes, Rex was leading her around the property's perimeter, showing her the boundaries of the areas he considered dangerous, while staying carefully within the zones he deemed safe. Sarah noticed immediately that Rex's behavior wasn't random fear, but calculated caution based on information his senses were providing. The dog had created a mental map of the property that divided it into safe and dangerous zones, and he was trying to communicate that map to the humans who couldn't detect what he could smell and sense. Sarah's environmental training helped her recognize the significance of Rex's behavior patterns, and she began to understand that they were dealing with contamination far more serious than simple industrial waste. Frank found Harold Wright working in his vegetable garden 3 houses down from the scrap yard, carefully tending tomato plants that seemed impossibly healthy considering the industrial landscape surrounding them. Harold was one of those men who had lived in the same place his entire life, watching neighborhoods change around him, while he remained constant as a landmark. At 78, he still maintained his small house with the precision of someone who had worked with his hands for decades. His memory was sharp, especially when it came to local history that others preferred to forget. When Frank introduced himself as the new owner of the old scrap yard, Harold's expression grew serious. He set down his gardening tools and invited Frank inside for coffee, saying there were things Frank needed to know about the land he had purchased. Harold's kitchen was clean and organized, with newspaper clippings covering one wall like a timeline of local events. He pointed to a yellowed article from 1993 with the headline "Chemical Plant Accident Under Investigation." The story was brief, mentioning an incident at Meridian Industries that had been quickly contained with no injuries reported. But Harold remembered more than what made it into the newspapers. Late one night in September of that year, he had watched trucks leaving the Meridian plant and heading toward the empty land that would later become Frank's scrap yard. The trucks moved slowly, as if carrying heavy loads, and the drivers wore protective suits that covered them completely. Harold had thought about reporting what he saw, but Meridian Industries employed half the town, and people learned not to ask too many questions about things that didn't directly concern them. The old man's hands shook slightly as he poured coffee, and Frank could see the weight of 30 years of keeping quiet about something that had clearly troubled him deeply. Harold explained that in the weeks following that night, several of his neighbors had developed mysterious illnesses, and a few had even died, but no one ever connected those deaths to what had been buried just a few hundred yards from their homes. The cover-up had been so complete that even Harold had begun to doubt his own memories, until Frank's questions brought it all back to the surface. The abandoned trailer that Frank had noticed on his first day turned out to be more than just another piece of debris. When he and Rex approached it the following morning, the dog's anxiety was palpable, but he followed Frank's lead with the disciplined obedience of a military animal who trusted his handler's judgment. The trailer's door hung on broken hinges, and the interior smelled of mold and old paper. Filing cabinets lined one wall, most of them empty or filled with documents too water-damaged to read. But in the bottom drawer of a desk near the window, Frank found a manila folder that had been protected by a plastic bag. The contents made his blood run cold. Purchase orders from Meridian Industries dated throughout 1993, all signed by someone named R. Kellerman. Chemical formulas that Frank didn't recognize, but with warning symbols that were unmistakably dangerous. And most disturbing of all, a hand-drawn map of the property showing numbered locations where something had been buried. The map matched the layout of Frank's land exactly, including features that hadn't been visible from the surface. Rex sniffed at the papers with obvious distress, backing away when Frank held them too close. As Frank studied the documents, trying to piece together their meaning, he began to understand why Rex had been so frightened. This wasn't just abandoned industrial waste. This was evidence of something that powerful people had worked very hard to hide. The documentation was too organized, too systematic to be anything other than a deliberate operation. Frank's military experience had taught him to recognize the difference between accidents and cover-ups. And everything about these documents screamed cover-up. The signatures were too clean, the disposal locations too carefully planned, and the timing too convenient to be anything other than a coordinated effort to make dangerous materials disappear. What made it even more sinister was the level of detail in the documentation, suggesting that whoever had organized this operation had been planning it for months, if not years, and had taken great care to ensure that every aspect of the burial process was recorded for future reference. Sarah arrived the next morning with professional-grade radiation detection equipment borrowed from the Environmental Sciences department at the nearby university. The device was far more sensitive than Frank's old Geiger counter, capable of detecting specific types of radioactive materials and measuring contamination levels with scientific precision. Rex greeted Sarah with obvious relief, as if he understood that reinforcements had arrived. Together, the three of them began a systematic survey of the property, following the locations marked on the buried map that Frank had discovered. The readings were worse than either Frank or Sarah had expected. What they found wasn't just trace contamination from industrial accidents, but deliberate burial sites containing materials that registered as highly radioactive. Sarah's training in environmental science told her they were looking at weapons-grade nuclear waste, the kind of material that required federal oversight and specialized disposal procedures. Rex seemed to understand the gravity of what they were discovering. Instead of his earlier fearful behavior, the dog became intensely focused, leading them from site to site with the methodical precision of a working dog following a scent trail. At each location, Sarah's equipment confirmed what Rex already knew: dangerous materials had been buried here decades ago, and time had done nothing to reduce their deadly potential. As Sarah documented their findings with photographs and measurements, Frank realized that his $450 investment had bought him a piece of one of the most dangerous cover-ups in the region's history. The implications were staggering, not just for his own health and safety, but for the entire community of Riverside. Groundwater contamination, air quality issues, and the potential for widespread illness suddenly seemed like very real possibilities that had been ignored for 3 decades. Sarah's scientific analysis revealed contamination levels that were far beyond what could be considered safe for human exposure, and the distribution pattern suggested that the contamination was slowly spreading through the soil and groundwater system, potentially affecting a much larger area than just Frank's property. The realization that an entire community had been living unknowingly next to this buried threat filled both Frank and Sarah with a sense of urgency that bordered on panic. Frank's investigation took on new urgency when he decided to research the name R. Kellerman from the Meridian Industries documents. A trip to the public library and some careful internet searching revealed information that made Frank's military training kick into high alert mode. Richard Kellerman wasn't just some forgotten engineer from a defunct chemical company. He was currently the mayor of Riverside, a position he had held for 12 years, after a successful career in environmental consulting. Campaign photographs showed a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and the confident smile of someone accustomed to public trust. News articles praised Mayor Kellerman's commitment to economic development and environmental responsibility, but Frank now knew there was another side to that story. The timeline made perfect sense in the most disturbing way possible. After the Meridian Industries incident in 1993, Kellerman had left the company and eventually moved into politics, building his reputation on the very environmental issues he had once helped to cover up. Frank shared his discovery with Sarah when she returned to continue their survey work. Rex seemed to sense the increased tension, staying closer to both humans and displaying the alert vigilance that Frank recognized from their military days. The dog understood that they were no longer just dealing with dangerous chemicals buried in the ground. They were up against dangerous people who had spent decades building lives and careers on top of buried secrets. Frank's military instincts told him that discovery of Kellerman's involvement changed everything. This wasn't just environmental negligence anymore. It was a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of local government, with implications that could destroy careers and potentially put lives at risk if the wrong people decided the secret was worth protecting at any cost. The irony wasn't lost on Frank that the same man who had buried nuclear waste in his backyard was now the public face of environmental responsibility for the entire city. Mayor Kellerman's public statements about clean air and water initiatives took on a sinister new meaning when viewed through the lens of what Frank had discovered. It became clear that Kellerman's entire political career had been built on a foundation of lies, and his environmental advocacy was nothing more than an elaborate cover story designed to deflect attention from his own crimes. Frank realized that confronting someone with this much to lose would be extremely dangerous. But the thought of an entire community living in ignorance of the toxic threat in their midst made doing nothing an impossible option. Frank and Sarah began their excavation work at dawn the following day, both wearing protective suits that Sarah had requisitioned from the university's hazardous materials department. The suits were bulky and uncomfortable, but absolutely necessary given the radiation readings they had documented the day before. Rex watched their preparations with keen interest, his military training evident in the way he positioned himself to maintain visual contact with both humans while staying at a safe distance from the contaminated areas. Frank had spent the night studying the burial map from the Meridian Industries documents, cross-referencing it with the radiation readings Sarah had taken. The pattern was becoming clearer with each piece of evidence they uncovered. This wasn't random dumping, but a carefully orchestrated disposal operation that had been planned down to the smallest detail. Rex's behavior had become even more focused since they had begun wearing the protective equipment. The dog seemed to understand that they were preparing for something dangerous, and his alertness had shifted from fearful avoidance to protective vigilance. Frank noticed that Rex had positioned himself near the property's entrance, as if preparing to warn them of approaching visitors. The dog's instincts were proving invaluable, providing an early warning system that their equipment couldn't match. As Frank began the delicate work of excavating the first marked burial site, Sarah monitored radiation levels and documented everything with her camera. The first container they fully exposed made both Frank and Sarah step back in alarm. It was a steel drum marked with the distinctive trefoil radiation symbol, along with text that identified its contents as enriched uranium compounds from a classified government research program. Sarah's radiation detector immediately began clicking rapidly, indicating contamination levels that were far beyond anything either of them had expected to find. Rex had positioned himself upwind from the excavation site, his nose working constantly to monitor the air for dangerous particles that might escape from the disturbed soil. Frank's military experience with hazardous materials told him that they were looking at weapons-grade nuclear waste, the kind of material that required specialized federal facilities for safe disposal. The implications were staggering. Not only had Meridian Industries been illegally disposing of nuclear waste, but they had been handling materials that suggested involvement in classified military programs. Sarah took photographs of the container from every angle, documenting the serial numbers and warning labels that would eventually serve as evidence in what was likely to become a federal investigation. As they carefully resealed the excavation site with protective covering, both Frank and Sarah realized that they had stumbled onto something far more dangerous and complex than simple industrial pollution. Rex continued his vigilant watch, but Frank noticed that the dog's attention kept shifting toward the access road, as if he was expecting unwelcome visitors who might be monitoring their activities. The discovery of classified nuclear materials meant that their investigation had moved beyond local environmental concerns into the realm of national security, with all the dangers that such territory implied. Frank was photographing the serial numbers on the buried container when Rex suddenly stiffened. His ears pricked forward in the alert position that Frank recognized as a warning of approaching people. The dog's low growl confirmed Frank's suspicion that they were no longer alone on the property. Sarah looked up from her radiation measurements as a black sedan pulled through the damaged gate, followed by a second identical vehicle. The cars moved slowly across the uneven ground, their occupants clearly unfamiliar with the terrain, but determined to reach Frank and Sarah's location. Rex positioned himself between the approaching vehicles and his humans, his body language shifting into full protective mode. Frank recognized the tactical approach of the vehicles and the professional way they had spread out to block potential escape routes. These weren't casual visitors or local officials making a routine inspection. Frank helped Sarah quickly gather their equipment and documentation, both of them moving with the efficiency of people who understood that their window of opportunity for peaceful resolution was rapidly closing. As the vehicles came to a stop approximately 50 yards from their excavation site, Frank could see that the occupants were wearing business suits and sunglasses despite the overcast sky, a detail that confirmed his suspicion that they were dealing with federal agents or private security personnel with government connections. Rex's growl intensified as men began emerging from both vehicles, his instincts clearly identifying them as a threat to his pack. Frank counted 6 men total, all of them moving with the coordinated precision of a trained team. Sarah whispered that she had managed to upload some of their photographic evidence to a secure cloud server before the vehicles had arrived, ensuring that their discoveries wouldn't disappear even if they were forced to surrender their equipment. Mayor Richard Kellerman stepped out of the lead vehicle, his distinguished appearance and confident demeanor immediately identifying him as the person in charge of this operation. Even wearing a business suit instead of protective gear, Kellerman moved toward the contaminated area with the familiarity of someone who knew exactly what lay buried beneath the soil. Frank noticed that Kellerman's security team maintained careful spacing and positioning, suggesting military or law enforcement training. Rex's reaction to Kellerman was immediate and intense, the dog's protective instincts triggered by something beyond simple territorial behavior. Frank realized that Rex was responding to Kellerman the same way he had responded to enemy combatants during their military service, recognizing a genuine threat to their safety. Kellerman approached with his hands visible, but his body language conveying authority and control, the bearing of a man accustomed to having his orders followed without question. When he spoke, his voice carried the smooth confidence of a practiced politician, but Frank could hear the underlying tension that suggested Kellerman was far more concerned about this situation than his calm exterior indicated. Kellerman's opening words confirmed Frank's worst suspicions about the scope of the conspiracy they had uncovered. The mayor didn't deny the presence of nuclear materials or express surprise at Frank's discoveries, instead speaking about national security implications and the need to contain information that could cause public panic. Sarah positioned herself behind Frank, her camera still recording despite the obvious danger of their situation. Rex remained alert and ready, his eyes fixed on Kellerman, while his peripheral awareness monitored the movements of the security team that had spread out to surround their position. Kellerman's explanation revealed the true scope of what Frank had purchased for $450. The burial site wasn't just a disposal area for industrial waste, but the final resting place for materials from a classified nuclear weapons research program that had operated in the region during the 1990s. According to Kellerman, the program had been shut down following international treaties, but the radioactive materials had required immediate and secure disposal to prevent them from falling into the wrong hands. The mayor spoke about patriotic duty and national security, painting the illegal burial as a necessary sacrifice to protect American interests during a critical period in the Cold War's aftermath. Frank's military background helped him recognize the mixture of truth and manipulation in Kellerman's explanation, understanding that while some classified program might have existed, the illegal disposal had been motivated more by cost savings and career protection than national security concerns. Sarah remained silent during Kellerman's monologue, but Frank could see her hands moving carefully to operate her recording equipment, documenting everything despite the obvious risks. Rex's behavior became increasingly agitated as Kellerman spoke, the dog apparently responding to stress pheromones or vocal patterns that indicated deception and danger. Kellerman's tone shifted from explanation to warning as he made it clear that Frank and Sarah had stumbled into matters that were far beyond their understanding or authority to investigate. The mayor's security team moved closer as he spoke, their positioning becoming more overtly threatening as Kellerman's diplomatic approach to fail achieved the compliance he obviously expected. Frank realized that Kellerman's willingness to appear personally at the contaminated site indicated just how seriously the mayor took the threat to his carefully constructed cover story. The standoff escalated when Sarah openly challenged Kellerman's version of events, pointing out that the documentation they had found showed systematic disposal operations that continued for months rather than the emergency situation Kellerman described. Her scientific training allowed her to identify inconsistencies in the mayor's explanation that revealed the profit-driven nature of the illegal dumping operation. Kellerman's composure began to crack as Sarah presented evidence that contradicted his national security narrative, forcing him to shift from persuasion to intimidation. Rex sensed the change in atmosphere immediately, his protective instincts fully activated as he recognized that the situation was moving from confrontation toward violence. Frank stepped forward to shield Sarah, his own military training, helping him assess the tactical situation and identify potential escape routes despite being outnumbered and surrounded. The mayor's security team responded to Frank's movement by reaching inside their jackets, a gesture that confirmed they were armed and prepared to escalate the confrontation to whatever level Kellerman deemed necessary. Sarah continued to document the encounter, understanding that their evidence might be the only thing standing between the truth and another 30 years of cover-up. Rex positioned himself for maximum protective effectiveness, his body coiled and ready to attack anyone who threatened his humans. Kellerman's final warning made it clear that Frank and Sarah had two choices: walk away immediately and forget everything they had discovered, or face consequences that the mayor was prepared to implement through his security team. Frank's response drew on his military oath and personal code of honor, making it clear that he would not be intimidated into abandoning his investigation of crimes that threatened the entire community. The mayor's expression hardened as he realized that Frank could not be bought, threatened, or reasoned into compliance, leaving Kellerman with options that would require crossing lines he had managed to avoid for 3 decades. The confrontation exploded into violence when Kellerman nodded to his security team, and one of the men drew a weapon, pointing it directly at Frank, while demanding that he and Sarah surrender all their evidence and equipment. Rex's response was instantaneous and devastating, the German Shepherd launching himself at the armed man with the lethal precision of a military-attacked dog. The sound of Rex's impact with the gunman echoed across the scrap yard, as 80 pounds of trained muscle and fury knocked the man backward into a pile of rusted metal debris. Frank didn't waste the opportunity Rex's attack had created, diving towards Sarah to shield her from the chaos while simultaneously grabbing a piece of steel pipe that could serve as a weapon. The remaining security team members scattered, trying to establish clear fields of fire while avoiding their fallen colleague, who was screaming as Rex maintained his grip on the man's gun arm. Kellerman shouted orders that were lost in the confusion, his carefully planned intimidation having devolved into exactly the kind of violent confrontation he had hoped to avoid. Sarah rolled toward the excavated burial site, using the contaminated area as cover since she knew the security team would be reluctant to follow her into a radioactive zone. Rex released his first target and immediately engaged a second man who was trying to flank Frank's position, the dog's training allowing him to assess multiple threats and respond with tactical intelligence that matched any human soldier. Frank used his military combat experience to turn the scrap yard's chaotic terrain to his advantage, moving between the piles of debris while keeping the security team from establishing coordinated positions. The irony wasn't lost on Frank that he was fighting for his life on land contaminated by the very people who were now trying to kill him to protect their secret. The sound of gunfire echoed across the property as Kellerman's men began shooting at Frank's position, their bullets ricocheting off metal debris and creating sparks that threatened to ignite any flammable materials in the area. Frank's military training kicked into full combat mode as he realized that Kellerman's security team was prepared to use lethal force to protect the mayor's secret. Using the steel pipe as both weapon and tool, Frank disabled the second gunman by striking his weapon hand and following up with a blow that sent the man crashing into a stack of corroded car parts. Rex had moved to engage a third attacker, but Frank could see that the dog was beginning to favor his left rear leg, indicating an injury sustained during his initial assault. The German Shepherd's tactical instincts remained sharp despite his injury, as he used the terrain to his advantage, darting between cover points and attacking from unexpected angles. Sarah had reached the relative safety of the excavated area, but Frank knew that her position was only temporary protection since the contaminated soil would eventually force her to move to avoid radiation exposure. Her radiation detector was clicking frantically in her position, providing an audible warning that helped guide both Frank and Rex away from the most dangerous areas during the firefight. A Kellerman was shouting into a radio, apparently calling for additional backup while trying to maintain control of a situation that had spiraled completely beyond his ability to manage quietly. Frank worked his way toward Sarah's position, using his knowledge of the property's layout to stay ahead of the security team's attempts to surround him. The sound of approaching sirens in the distance suggested that someone had called law enforcement, though Frank wasn't certain whether the responding officers would be allies or additional threats controlled by Kellerman's influence. Rex limped toward Frank's position, still alert and ready to fight despite his injury, the dog's loyalty overriding any concern for his own safety. Frank realized that their only chance of survival lay in reaching the area where Sarah had uploaded their evidence to the cloud server, hoping that the documentation would provide enough leverage to force Kellerman to call off his attack. The mayor's desperation was becoming increasingly obvious as he directed his remaining men to prevent Frank and Sarah from escaping with evidence that could destroy not only his political career, but potentially result in federal charges that would put him in prison for the rest of his life. Frank noticed that Kellerman's security team was becoming more aggressive and reckless in their attacks, suggesting that the mayor had given them orders to eliminate all witnesses regardless of the consequences. Rex's military training proved invaluable as he continued to harass the attackers, using hit-and-run tactics that kept them off balance and prevented them from coordinating their assault effectively. The German Shepherd's ability to move silently through the debris field allowed him to appear where enemies least expected him, creating confusion and fear among Kellerman's men who weren't accustomed to fighting an opponent who could attack from any direction without warning. Frank used Rex's distraction tactics to advance closer to Sarah's position, though he was forced to take increasingly dangerous routes through areas where his radiation detector was clicking at alarming rates. Sarah continued to document everything with her camera, understanding that their evidence might be the only thing preventing Kellerman from successfully covering up his crimes with their deaths. The firefight had created clouds of dust and debris that provided additional cover, but also made it difficult for Frank to keep track of all the attackers who were trying to surround his position. Rex appeared at Frank's side just as two of Kellerman's men attempted a coordinated assault from different directions, the dog's warning growl alerting Frank to the threat before the attackers could achieve surprise. Frank and Rex worked together to defeat this assault, with the dog attacking one man's legs, while Frank disabled the other with his improvised weapon, their partnership demonstrating the kind of seamless cooperation that only comes from years of training and mutual trust. Sarah's scientific training proved invaluable, as she used her knowledge of radiation exposure to create a defensive perimeter that the security team couldn't safely cross without protective equipment. She had positioned herself near the most heavily contaminated burial site, where her radiation detector was clicking so rapidly that it sounded like a continuous alarm, indicating exposure levels that would be dangerous within minutes and potentially lethal within hours. Frank reached her position just as one of Kellerman's men attempted to circle around through the contaminated zone, forcing Frank to tackle the man and wrestle for control of his weapon while both of them were exposed to dangerous radiation levels. The struggle was brief but intense, with Frank using his superior combat training to overpower the security guard, while Rex attacked from behind, ensuring that the threat was eliminated quickly to minimize radiation exposure. Sarah shouted warnings about radiation exposure times, reminding Frank that even their brief contact with the most contaminated soil could have serious health consequences if they didn't decontaminate quickly. Kellerman's remaining security team had regrouped near their vehicles, apparently reassessing their strategy in light of the fierce resistance they had encountered and the arrival of what sounded like multiple emergency vehicles approaching the property. Frank helped Sarah gather their essential evidence, while Rex maintained a defensive position, the injured dog still capable of detecting and warning against approaching threats despite his obvious pain and possible radiation exposure. The German Shepherd's dedication to his protective duties was absolute, even as Frank could see that the dog was struggling with fatigue and the cumulative effects of his injuries from multiple fights. The sound of helicopter rotors added a new dimension to the chaos, though Frank couldn't determine whether the aircraft represented rescue or additional danger from federal agencies that might be working to protect Kellerman's secret. Sarah's radiation detector continued its frantic clicking as they moved away from the most contaminated areas, providing an audible reminder of the invisible danger that surrounded them, even as they fought for their lives against the very visible threat of Kellerman's armed men. Frank realized that Rex was pushing himself beyond safe limits in his determination to protect his human companions, and he made the difficult decision to order the dog to take cover while he handled the remaining threats alone. Rex initially refused to obey the command, his military training and personal loyalty making it impossible for him to abandon his protective duties, even when ordered to do so by his handler. Frank had to use his most authoritative command voice to convince Rex to seek shelter behind a pile of concrete debris though the dog maintained visual contact and remained ready to rejoin the fight if his handler's situation became desperate. This tactical separation allowed Frank to take greater risks in his movements, knowing that Rex was safe from immediate danger, while still positioned to provide backup if needed. Kellerman's security team made one final coordinated assault on Frank's position, using their numerical advantage to attack from multiple directions simultaneously in an attempt to overwhelm his defenses. Frank's combat experience allowed him to recognize the attack pattern and position himself to defeat it, using the terrain and debris to channel his attackers into positions where he could engage them individually rather than facing them all at once. The fight was brutal and exhausting, with Frank drawing on every technique he had learned during his military service to survive against opponents who were younger, better equipped, and more numerous than he was. Rex watched the battle from his covered position, whining with frustration at being unable to help his handler, but following orders with the discipline that had been drilled into him during their military service together. Frank's victory over the security team came at significant cost, leaving him battered, exhausted, and exposed to dangerous levels of radiation, but alive and still in possession of the evidence that could bring Kellerman to justice. The arrival of FBI helicopters changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation, as federal agents repelled from the aircraft with the kind of professional efficiency that made Kellerman's private security team look like amateurs. Frank initially wasn't certain whether the FBI agents were there to rescue them or to silence them on behalf of federal interests, but their immediate actions in securing Kellerman and his men suggested that someone in Washington had decided the mayor's cover-up had become more liability than asset. Sarah waved her radiation detector at the approaching agents, shouting warnings about contamination levels that forced the federal team to adjust their approach and call for hazardous materials specialists. The FIFB's response demonstrated the kind of professional competence that Frank had rarely seen outside of military operations, with agents immediately establishing secure perimeters, calling for appropriate specialist support, and beginning the process of evidence collection that would ensure proper prosecution of everyone involved in the cover-up. Rex emerged from his shelter at Frank's command, limping toward his handler with obvious relief that reinforcements had arrived and the immediate danger was over. Frank knelt beside Rex, checking the dog's injuries while keeping watch for any remaining threats from Kellerman's security team, though most of them had surrendered or fled when the FBI helicopters appeared. The German Shepherd's condition was concerning, with obvious injuries to his leg and possible internal damage from his multiple fights, but his eyes remained alert and focused on his handler with the unwavering loyalty that had characterized their entire partnership. Kellerman himself stood with his hands raised, his political composure finally cracking as he realized that his 30-year secret was about to become a federal investigation that would expose not only his own crimes, but potentially implicate others in Washington who had helped facilitate the cover-up. Sarah continued documenting everything with her camera, understanding that their evidence would be crucial in ensuring that the truth about the contaminated burial site couldn't be suppressed again by powerful interests who might prefer to see the entire matter quietly disappeared. The FBI agents established a secure perimeter around the contaminated area, while calling for specialized teams to handle the radioactive materials that Frank and Sarah had discovered, demonstrating the kind of systematic approach that gave Frank confidence that the federal investigation would be thorough and professional. Frank realized that Rex's brave actions had not only saved their lives, but had also ensured that the truth about the buried nuclear waste would finally be exposed to proper federal oversight, breaking a cycle of cover-up and denial that had lasted for 3 decades. The German Shepherd's military training and absolute loyalty had proven once again that the bond between a soldier and his service dog could overcome seemingly impossible odds when the cause was just and the stakes were high enough to demand ultimate sacrifice. But Kellerman's arrest by federal agents marked the beginning of what Frank suspected would be a complex investigation involving multiple government agencies and potentially reaching high levels of political power. But he was confident that Rex's heroic actions had ensured that the truth would finally emerge regardless of who might prefer to keep it buried. Sarah's scientific documentation and Frank's military testimony would provide the foundation for prosecution efforts that could result in not only criminal convictions, but also comprehensive environmental cleanup efforts that would protect them from further exposure to buried radioactive materials. Rex lay quietly beside Frank as paramedics examined his injuries. The dog's trust in his handler allowing the medical personnel to work while Rex conserved his strength for whatever challenges might still lie ahead in their fight for environmental justice. Kellerman's desperation reached its peak when he realized that the FBI's arrival meant his political career and personal freedom were both finished, leading him to make one final attempt to destroy the evidence that could implicate him in 3 decades of environmental crimes. Breaking away from the federal agents who were focused on securing the contaminated area, Kellerman ran toward a fuel storage tank that had been left behind by previous occupants of the scrap yard, apparently intending to create an explosion that would scatter radioactive materials across a wide area and make detailed investigation impossible. Frank spotted Kellerman's movement and immediately understood the mayor's intention, realizing that an explosion in the contaminated zone could create a radiological disaster that would affect the entire region for generations to come. Despite his exhaustion and concern for Rex's injuries, Frank pursued Kellerman across the debris-filled landscape, drawing on his military training to intercept the mayor before he could reach the fuel storage area and implement his catastrophic final plan. Rex, summoning his remaining strength despite his injuries and possible radiation exposure, limped after Frank with the determination of a soldier who refused to abandon his mission, even in the face of overwhelming odds and personal danger. Sarah shouted warnings to the FBI agents about Kellerman's apparent suicide mission, her scientific understanding of radiological dispersion making her acutely aware of the catastrophic consequences if the mayor succeeded in his desperate plan to destroy evidence and create chaos. The federal agents immediately shifted their focus to stopping Kellerman, but Frank was closer and had the advantage of knowing the property's layout from his weeks of exploration and excavation work, giving him the best chance of intercepting the mayor before disaster could strike. Kellerman reached the fuel tank just seconds ahead of Frank, producing a lighter and shouting about protecting national security, even as he prepared to commit an act that would contaminate hundreds of square miles with radioactive debris and potentially kill thousands of people through radiation exposure. Frank's tackle sent both men crashing into the metal debris surrounding the fuel tank, the impact knocking the lighter from Kellerman's hand and sending it spinning away into the contaminated soil, where neither man dared to retrieve it without protective equipment. The struggle that followed was desperate and brutal, with Kellerman fighting like a man who knew that capture meant the end of everything he had built over 3 decades of careful deception and political maneuvering. Frank's military combat training gave him advantages in the physical confrontation, but Kellerman's desperation made him dangerous and unpredictable, willing to risk mutual destruction rather than face the consequences of his crimes. Rex dragged himself toward the fight despite his injuries, prepared to defend Frank even though the dog's strength was nearly exhausted from his earlier battles and the cumulative effects of possible radiation exposure throughout the day. The German Shepherd's approach was slow and painful, but his determination was absolute, driven by loyalty that transcended physical limitations and personal safety concerns. Sarah directed the FBI agents toward Frank's position while maintaining safe distance from the most contaminated areas, her radiation detector providing crucial guidance that allowed the federal team to approach without exposing themselves to dangerous levels of radioactivity that could compromise their ability to help. Kellerman's political facade completely collapsed as he screamed about patriotic duty and national security while trying to strangle Frank with pieces of wire from the debris pile, his actions revealing the violent desperation that had always lurked beneath his public persona of environmental responsibility and civic leadership. Frank managed to pin Kellerman long enough for the FBI agents to reach their position, though the effort required him to remain in the contaminated zone longer than was safe, adding to his cumulative radiation exposure from the day's activities and potentially affecting his long-term health. Rex arrived at the moment of Kellerman's capture, the loyal dog positioning himself between Frank and any remaining threats even though he could barely stand, his devotion to his handler unchanged despite his physical exhaustion and obvious need for immediate medical attention. The mayor's arrest by federal agents marked the end of the violent confrontation, but Frank realized that the larger battle for environmental justice and accountability was just beginning, with Rex having proven once again that a soldier's most reliable ally is often the four-legged companion who never questions orders to protect and serve regardless of personal cost or danger. As FBI hazardous materials teams secured the contaminated burial sites and began the process of documenting 3 decades of illegal nuclear waste disposal, Frank knelt beside Rex to assess his loyal companion's injuries and provide what comfort he could to the dog, who had saved both their lives multiple times during the day's battle against corruption and environmental crime. Rex's injuries were serious but not immediately life-threatening, though the dog's possible radiation exposure would require ongoing medical monitoring and treatment that Frank was determined to provide regardless of cost, understanding that his companion's heroic service had earned the best possible care available. Sarah worked with the federal agents to transfer all their photographic evidence and scientific measurements, ensuring that the full scope of Kellerman's environmental crimes would be properly documented and prosecuted, while also providing crucial information about contamination levels that would guide the cleanup efforts and protect future investigators from radiation exposure. Kellerman sat in federal custody, his political career destroyed and his freedom forfeit, facing charges that would likely result in life imprisonment for crimes against both the environment and the community he had sworn to protect as mayor. Frank realized that his $450 investment had uncovered one of the most significant environmental cover-ups in the region's history, transforming his simple plan to start a scrap metal business into a federal case that would protect countless lives from continued exposure to buried radioactive materials. Rex's heroic actions had not only saved Frank and Sarah from Kellerman's security team, but had also ensured that the truth about the contaminated burial sites would finally be exposed to proper federal oversight and cleanup efforts that would benefit the entire community for generations to come. 6 months after the confrontation at the scrap yard, Frank Martinez stood in a federal courtroom watching as both Mayor Richard Kellerman and the woman he now knew as Judge Margaret Thornfield were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The revelation that Thornfield was actually a sitting judge on the state's highest court had sent shockwaves through the legal and political establishment, exposing a conspiracy that reached far deeper into the power structure than anyone had initially imagined. Rex sat beside Frank in the courtroom, his injuries fully healed but his left leg still bearing a slight limp that served as a permanent reminder of his heroic actions during that dangerous day. The German Shepherd wore a special vest identifying him as a federal witness protection dog, a designation that provided him with the same legal protections afforded to human witnesses in high-profile cases. Frank had testified for 3 days about the events at the contaminated site, his military bearing and obvious sincerity, making a powerful impression on the jury and federal prosecutors who were building cases against dozens of other officials who had participated in the cover-up over 3 decades. Sarah Chen had become the prosecution's star scientific witness, her detailed documentation and radiation measurements providing irrefutable proof of the environmental crimes that had been committed with the full knowledge and approval of elected officials who had sworn to protect public health and safety. The courtroom was packed with residents of Riverside and surrounding communities, many of whom had lost family members to cancers and other illnesses that federal investigators now believed were directly linked to groundwater contamination from the buried nuclear waste. Frank realized that his $450 investment had not only uncovered massive criminal conspiracy, but had also provided closure and justice for families who had spent years wondering why their loved ones had died from mysterious illnesses that doctors couldn't explain. The federal cleanup operation at Frank's former property had become the largest environmental remediation project in the state's history, with teams of specialists working around the clock to safely extract and properly dispose of nuclear materials that had been buried for 30 years. Frank had been relocated to temporary housing during the cleanup process, But the government had provided him with a new home in a safer area along with a substantial settlement that would ensure his financial security for the rest of his life. Rex had become something of a celebrity during the trial proceedings, with media outlets calling him a hero dog whose instincts and courage had prevented an environmental disaster that could have affected millions of people. The German Shepherd's story had inspired donations from across the country to support veteran service dog programs, with Rex serving as the unofficial mascot for organizations that train dogs to help veterans transition to civilian life. Sarah had accepted a position with the Environmental Protection Agency, where her expertise in radiation detection and environmental health would help identify and remediate other contaminated sites that might be hidden throughout the country. Frank and Sarah's relationship had deepened during the months of testimony and legal proceedings, their shared experience of danger and their common commitment to environmental justice creating a bond that had grown into love and mutual respect. Rex approved of Sarah's presence in their lives, treating her with the same protective loyalty he had always shown toward Frank, accepting her as a permanent member of their small family. The cleanup work had revealed even more buried containers than Frank and Sarah had initially discovered, with some materials dating back to secret nuclear weapons research conducted during the Cold War era, with full government knowledge and approval. Frank learned that his property had been just one of dozens of illegal disposal sites, scattered across multiple states, part of a systematic program to hide evidence of environmental crimes that could have embarrassed powerful political and military leaders. Rex had been trained as a specialized detection dog for hazardous materials, his natural instincts enhanced by professional training that allowed him to identify nuclear waste, chemical weapons, and other dangerous substances that posed threats to public health and safety. The program that trained Rex was funded by the settlement money from the Kellerman case, ensuring that other service dogs would be available to help detect environmental crimes before they could harm innocent communities. Frank had found new purpose in his work with the EPA and FBI, serving as a consultant who helped investigate suspected contamination sites and trained other veterans to recognize signs of environmental cover-ups. His military experience and his knowledge of the Kellerman case made him uniquely qualified to understand how government officials might attempt to hide evidence of environmental crimes from public scrutiny. Rex accompanied Frank on these investigations, his reputation as a hero dog making him welcome at sites where other investigators might face local resistance from officials who preferred to keep secrets buried. The German Shepherd's presence also served as a reminder that environmental crimes affected not just human communities, but all living creatures who depended on clean air, water, and soil for their survival. Sarah's work with the EPA had led to the discovery of contaminated sites in 17 other states, many of them linked to the same network of officials and contractors who had worked with Kellerman and Thornfield to hide evidence of illegal disposal operations. Frank realized that their fight against environmental crime had evolved from a personal battlefield for survival into a national mission to protect communities from the kind of toxic legacy that had been buried beneath his property for 3 decades. Rex's heroic actions had not only saved Frank and Sarah's lives, but had also sparked a federal investigation that was still uncovering new evidence of environmental crimes and bringing justice to victims whose suffering had been ignored for generations. The final piece of justice came when Frank learned that the auction, where he had purchased the contaminated property, had been rigged by Thornfield and Kellerman, who had manipulated the bidding process to ensure that the land would be sold to someone who lacked the resources and knowledge to investigate its toxic secrets. The conspiracy had included forged environmental assessments, bribed inspectors, and falsified property records that had hidden the true history of the site from potential buyers and regulatory agencies. Frank's military background and his partnership with Rex had been the unexpected factors that destroyed a cover-up that had been designed to last forever, proving that sometimes the most important battles are won by ordinary people who refuse to accept official lies and government deception. Margaret Thornfield's role as a state Supreme Court judge had allowed her to influence legal proceedings for 30 years, ensuring that any lawsuits or investigations related to environmental contamination were dismissed or redirected away from the truth that could have exposed her own crimes. Her judicial corruption had affected hundreds of cases and thousands of victims, making her one of the most destructive criminals in the state's legal history despite her public reputation as a champion of environmental justice and government transparency. Frank testified about the moment when Rex had first detected the contamination, describing how his dog's military training and natural instincts had immediately recognized dangers that human senses couldn't detect, providing the first warning that something terrible was hidden beneath the seemingly innocent scrap yard. The federal prosecutors used Frank's testimony to demonstrate how the conspiracy had been designed to exploit the trust that citizens place in their elected officials, turning public service into a cover for crimes that endangered entire communities for the benefit of a few corrupt individuals. Rex's story became a symbol of the loyalty and courage that Americans expect from their public servants, contrasting the dog's heroic actions with the cowardice and greed that had motivated the human criminals who had betrayed their oaths of office. Frank's final testimony focused on the broader implications of the Kellerman-Thornfield conspiracy, explaining how their crimes had not only endangered public health, but had also undermined faith in democratic institutions and environmental protection agencies that are supposed to serve the people rather than corporate interests. He described the moment when he realized that his simple desire to start a small business had uncovered a network of corruption that reached from local government to federal agencies, illustrating how environmental crime often involves the abuse of public trust by officials who are supposed to protect the very communities they are actually poisoning. Rex's role in exposing the conspiracy demonstrated the importance of maintaining the military values of loyalty, courage, and service even after transitioning to civilian life, showing how veterans and their service dogs can continue to serve their communities by fighting different kinds of enemies in different kinds of battles. Frank's partnership with Sarah had evolved into a model for the kind of collaboration between military veterans and scientific professionals that was needed to identify and combat environmental crimes that threatened public health across the country. Their work with federal agencies had led to new protocols for investigating suspected contamination sites, ensuring that future cover-ups would be more difficult to maintain, and that victims would have better access to justice and compensation for their suffering. Frank realized that his story with Rex had become part of a larger narrative about the importance of holding powerful people accountable for their crimes, regardless of their political positions or social status, and about the role that ordinary citizens can play in protecting their communities from those who would sacrifice public safety for personal gain. The bond between Frank and Rex had been strengthened by their shared experience of danger and their successful fight for environmental justice, proving once again that the partnership between a veteran and his service dog could overcome seemingly impossible odds when the cause was righteous and the stakes were high enough to demand courage and sacrifice. Rex's recovery from his injuries had been complete, but the dog's behavior had changed in subtle ways that reflected his understanding of the important work they were doing together to protect innocent people from environmental criminals who hid their crimes behind official titles and government positions. Frank's new mission as an environmental investigator had given him a sense of purpose that filled the void left by his wife's death and his transition from military to civilian life, proving that veterans could find meaningful ways to continue serving their country even after their formal military service had ended. Sarah's love for both Frank and Rex had created a family structure that provided stability and emotional support for the difficult work they were doing to expose environmental crimes and bring justice to victims who had suffered in silence for decades. Their story had inspired other veterans to become involved in environmental protection efforts, creating a network of former military personnel who used their training and experience to identify and combat threats to public health and safety that government officials might prefer to ignore or cover up. Frank often reflected on the irony that his $450 purchase had led to one of the most significant environmental justice victories in American history, demonstrating that sometimes the most important battles begin with the smallest steps taken by people who simply refuse to accept that dangerous secrets should remain buried forever. The legacy of Frank and Rex's heroic actions extended far beyond the criminal convictions and environmental cleanup, inspiring a new generation of Americans to demand accountability from their elected officials and to trust their own instincts when something seems wrong with official explanations for environmental problems or public health crises. Their story became required reading in military academies and environmental science programs, illustrating how the values of service, loyalty, and courage could be applied to civilian challenges that required the same dedication and sacrifice that military personnel showed on the battlefield. Rex's fame as a hero dog had led to movie and book deals, with all proceeds donated to organizations that trained service dogs for veterans and supported environmental cleanup efforts in communities that had been affected by industrial contamination and government cover-ups. Frank's testimony before Congress had resulted in new laws, requiring more stringent oversight of hazardous waste disposal and stronger penalties for officials who participated in environmental cover-ups, ensuring that future generations would be better protected from the kind of toxic legacy that had been buried beneath his property. The Kellerman-Thornfield case had become a landmark in environmental law, establishing precedents that made it easier for victims of environmental crimes to seek justice and compensation, while making it more difficult for corrupt officials to hide their crimes by claims of national security or executive privilege. Frank Martinez and his loyal companion Rex had proven that ordinary Americans, armed with courage, determination, and an unshakable commitment to truth, could defeat even the most powerful and well-connected criminals when the cause was just and the stakes involved the health and safety of entire communities. As Frank reflected on their incredible journey from a simple real estate purchase to a federal environmental justice case that had changed laws and saved lives, he understood that his partnership with Rex represented something larger than their individual story, embodying the American ideals of service, sacrifice, and the belief that right will ultimately triumph over wrong when good people refuse to remain silent in the face of corruption and injustice. Rex had not only saved Frank's life during their battle with Kellerman's security team, but had also saved the lives of countless community members who might have continued to suffer from exposure to buried radioactive waste if the conspiracy had remained hidden for another generation. Their story reminded Americans that environmental protection was not just a policy issue, but a matter of life and death that required the same kind of courage and dedication that military personnel showed when defending their country against foreign enemies, proving that some battles for freedom and safety had to be fought on American soil, against American criminals who betrayed their oaths and endangered their own people for personal gain. Frank's message to other veterans was simple but powerful. The fight to protect innocent people never ends. It just changes venues from foreign battlefields to contaminated properties in American communities where corrupt officials have buried toxic secrets that threaten public health and environmental safety. Rex's example showed that loyalty, courage, and service were not just military virtues, but essential qualities for anyone who wanted to make a difference in protecting their community from those who would sacrifice public welfare for private benefit. Their partnership had demonstrated that sometimes the most important victories are won not through violence and warfare, but through persistence, integrity, and the willingness to stand up to powerful people who believe their positions make them immune from accountability for their crimes against the environment and the people they were elected to serve. I hope you found inspiration in Frank and Rex's story of courage, loyalty, and environmental justice. If you have your own story about a loyal companion who made a difference in your life, please share it in the comments below. Your experiences matter and could inspire others who are facing their own battles against injustice. Please subscribe to our channel so you won't miss more incredible stories about the unbreakable bonds between veterans and their four-legged heroes. And don't forget to check out the next amazing story that's appearing on your screen right now, because there are so many more tales of courage and loyalty waiting to be told. To all our veterans and their families, thank you for your service and sacrifice in protecting the freedoms we all cherish.